Hi everyone, this is Brian. I'm one of the tech assistants for the Educator Collaborative, and we're about ready to start session 1, our 4th workshop, and I'm going to turn it over to Chad Everett now, who is going to present Kim Yaris for us. So Chad, it's over to you.
Thanks, Brian. Hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for a great day of learning. I'm honored to get introduced to you, Kim Yaris. She is co-author of Reading Wellness with Jan Birkins. She's a part of the Birkins and Yaris think tank for 21st century literacy. She's got 40 years of combined experience with her co-author.
Brian, I'm one of the tech assistants for the Educator Collaborative.
With her co-author, Jan. She is just awesome, a thought leader in the field. I'm so excited to hear what she has to share with us about building a community of strong readers. So, Kim, take it over.
All right. Well, thank you, Chad, for that introduction, and Brian for all of your help this morning. And so I start by saying, good morning, everybody. I feel so honored to be in the company of such dedicated learners. I appreciate that you are spending part of your Saturday morning with me, and wanted to give a shout out to Chris Lehman, who organized this event. This is such a cool way for educators to connect and share. So thank you, Chris. Though Jan is not here, she is here with us in spirit, and every bit of what I'm going to share with you today, we worked on together. All right, so to start. Okay. So this is Jan, so that you can see, and this is, in case you're interested, birkinsandyaris.com. But more importantly, I wanted to talk about if you are going to be tweeting at all today, we're using hashtag #EdCollabGathering, followed by a space, and then the number 4. And beneath that is the URL for the workshop in case you should need it for any reason. So I'll start by saying that because the school year is so relatively fresh and new, Jan and I thought it would be good to talk with you about a topic that we all tend to think a lot about at the beginning of the year: classroom community. Our learning communities have the potential to positively or negatively impact what children take away from their learning experiences. And unlike so many of the variables that feel beyond our control in education, our classroom environment is one variable that is entirely up to us. We can invest in our community or not, but when we do, we help children to feel safe. When children feel safe, they take risks and they challenge themselves. They engage in rich and lively conversations, which can lead to deep, insightful thinking. The better the community, the better the learning, which is why Jan and I thought to make classroom community the topic of today's webinar. Of course, as it often goes, when we got into the thick of the planning, the idea evolved, and rather than focusing on just the 3 lessons that we thought about originally, we ended up with 11 thoughts for building classroom community. All right, let's switch it back to me. All right. So as a vehicle for sharing these thoughts, let me tell you a little bit about how we planned for this to work. We decided to take you on a little tour. And during this tour, we're going to visit several different classrooms. Each of these classrooms have inspired our thinking, and our hope is that by sharing and visiting these classrooms together with us, they'll inspire your thinking as well and lend some new perspective about building a classroom of strong readers, a community of strong readers. I think that the first classroom that we go into, you'll probably recognize, but in case you don't, let me give you a little background information. The year is 1933, and we are in Macomb County, Alabama. Scout Finch is starting her first day of first grade. When we step into Scout's classroom, this is what we see. Her teacher, Miss Caroline, is starting the day reading a story aloud to the class. The story is either not that good or way too long, because the students are really starting to wiggle as she reads. They don't really seem all that engaged in what she's reading. But Miss Caroline doesn't seem to notice. She just keeps on reading the story. And when she's all done, she says, "Oh my, wasn't that nice?" And heads over to the chalkboard and begins writing the alphabet on the board. She asks the kids if any of them know what this is, and she calls on Scout to answer. Scout easily reads the alphabet on the board, and Miss Caroline seems a little bit surprised. She's suspicious, in fact. And so what she does is she hands Scout a primer, and Scout easily reads the stories. Then she gives her the Mobile Register and asks her if she can read some of the stock quotes. And Scout is confused, but then she becomes indignant because her teacher tells her to tell her father to stop teaching her how to read because it's going to interfere with her reading. Now, Scout starts to protest. However, she sees that she's getting in trouble, so she just takes her seat. But you know, she's stymied. I mean, her father is busy. He doesn't have time to teach her anything. And so she's just kind of feeling sad and disappointed that school isn't what she thought it was going to be. And at lunchtime or recess or something, she runs into her brother, who asks her how school is going. And he says, "If I didn't have to stay, I'd leave, Jem." Jem tries to make her feel better, and he tells her, "Our teacher says Miss Caroline's introducing a new way of teaching. She learned about it in college. It'll be in all the grades soon." Only I'm not sure that this is music to Scout's ears. For those of you who are not familiar, the story that I've just shared with you comes from Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. And every time I hear it, I think, oh, poor Scout. Poor Scout. It's the first day of first grade, and she's ready to quit. Certainly, this is not a community that we want to emulate. However, it does teach us an important lesson about building community. So I am going to switch over to the document camera. Okay. And what I've got is a notebook where I would like, as we go through here, to make some notes about the things that the different classrooms that we visit on our tour bring to mind. And the first thing that I am thinking about is that teaching begins with students. Our lessons are of little consequence when they don't take into account the students that we teach. Don't you wonder how Scout's experience could have been different if Miss Caroline embraced and encouraged what Scout already knew? And what about the other children in the class who were so disinterested in the pretend story about cats? Might there have been something more well-suited for her classroom filled with rural farm children? Okay. All right. I think that Miss Caroline could have benefited from this tour because the next classroom that we're going to visit is Bailey White's. Before she left the classroom for good in 1999, to become a full-time writer, she had been a classroom teacher, specifically a first grade classroom teacher, for over 20 years. In one of her books, Mama Makes Up Her Mind and Other Dangers of Southern Living, she recounts some of the methods for teaching children to read that came and went, one of which she called the word list method. Let me show you what that is. Give me a second. All right. All right. All right, so this is how the word list method works. You give kids a list of words. So we've got the, day, it, cat, car, is, now, here, good. And students have to work to learn the words in isolation. So once they've learned these words, they get to read books with just these words. The cat is here now. The car is here now. It is a good day. According to Bailey White, this method led to children reading some dreary stories that made it hard to hold children's interest. Yes, reading stuff like this all the time would be dreadful. Can you imagine? Okay. So another idea that, oops, I meant to bring us back. So another idea that Bailey White talked about was the cute idea method. So if you've been in teaching long enough, you're going to probably be familiar with this one too. So the cute idea method, it works like this. What you do is you trace circles onto construction paper, and then you make them into animals. So we've got another construction paper. So this was a circle. And then what you do is you put it together, then you write like it on this side and is on this side. And then you get one of those brass fasteners and you put it right here. And then what you have is a very cute idea. You have a little ladybug with it on one side and is on the other. And when you open it up, it says, it's adorable, right? Just adorable. However, I'm not sure that it does a tremendous amount for building great classroom communities and classrooms filled with readers. So what Bailey White said is that the only idea that ever really made a difference was what she called the Maritime disaster method. The Maritime disaster method worked like this. What you do is you write down sea shanties on a piece of chart paper, and then you start to sing them as you're pointing to the words. And what happens is kids start to realize that sailors fall overboard and ships sink to the bottom of the ocean. And then they want to learn the words too. And so as you're pointing, they're paying really close attention. And then they start to sing along with you. Once you've got them hooked on sea shanties, then you start to read them aloud stories about the Titanic. And after you've read the story about the Titanic, you set it up on the chalk tray when you're done, and then the kids just start to clamor to get that book that you just read aloud. So Bailey White says that what she discovered was that when children get the idea that written words can tell them something absolutely horrible, then half the battle of teaching is won. I think, and Jan and I think, that the real discovery was this. Is that we have to choose text carefully. When texts are interesting, we don't have to work hard at all to get children to want to read. It's like books take over and do part of the work, which makes it easier for us and more enjoyable for students. It's a real win-win. I love learning from great teachers, which makes me eager to take you to the next classroom. Are you ready to continue? This classroom is from Laura Amy Schlitz's new book, The Hired Girl. The story is set in rural Pennsylvania in 1905. In this story, Joan, the main character, remembers starting school for the first time in her life. She's 7 years old and worried because her brothers have had nothing but trouble in school, and she's unsure of what to expect. But what happens when she arrives is so magical. It's so good. And we are so grateful that we have permission from Candlewick to read to you straight from the book. So listen to what happens. My teacher was Miss Lang. She set the oldest girl in charge of the other students and took the whole primary class outside and had us sit under a tree. She sat in a chair and read to us from a book of fairy tales by Hans Christian Andersen. She read Thumbelina. I never heard such a story in my life. I could see it before my eyes, painted in the brightest, most delicate hues. That tiny little fairy child rowing her flower petal canoe. Oh, how I longed to be that fairy and row that tiny canoe. And then how terrible it was that poor Thumbelina was carried off by a toad. Luke used to put toads down my back, and I've always hated them. And then, after Thumbelina got free of the toad, she was carried off by a horrid June bug. And then, when she was shut of him, Thumbelina found the poor dead swallow resting in its tomb below the ground. I knew it would be shameful to cry in school, and I didn't want the teacher to think I was a baby. So I bent my head to hide my tears, but I couldn't bear the sorrow of the dead swallow and the joy I felt when Thumbelina nursed him and he turned out not to be dead after all. The joy and the wonder and the rightness of it. The story continues with Joan listening intently as her teacher reads the story. And when it ends, she forgets to raise her hand. And she's so worried that she's going to get in trouble. But instead, her teacher, her wonderful teacher, said, this is what she did. She gave me a lovely smile and said, when you learn to read, you'll be able to read that story all by yourself. I became a scholar that day. I hung on Miss Lang's words and did whatever she told me to do. Miss Lang said that learning the letters was the beginning of reading. So when I lay in bed at night, I stroked my ABCs on my pillowcase and made consonant sounds under my breath. I learned to read quickly. How lucky is Joan? Her teacher was so wise. She reminds us that not only should we choose stories that make kids want to read, we should also read aloud often. I love the part where it says, I became a scholar that day. Stories have the power to help children imagine possibilities for themselves. wouldn't it be wonderful if our classrooms were filled with children dreaming big who saw themselves as scholars? What a wonderful place that would be to learn. It also makes me wonder, besides reading aloud, how else do we get children to think about themselves as scholars? Fortunately, in their book, Switch, How to Change Things When Change is Hard, Chip and Dan Heath help us to answer that question by introducing us to Crystal Jones. Crystal is, it's 2003, and Crystal Jones was teaching first grade in Atlanta, Georgia. In the school where she taught, there was no kindergarten, and most of the kids coming into her first grade had never been to school before. This meant that many of her students didn't know their letters, and compared to most first graders across the United States, her first graders were significantly behind. Left to figure out what she was going to do to bridge this gap that was created by time and circumstance, Crystal knew that she needed a plan, and hers was to motivate students. How was she going to do this? Well, interestingly, the thing that she did was she taught her children the word scholars. Every time someone new visited their classroom, she introduced the kids as scholars. And being scholars made these children very proud, and they always made it a point to tell the person who was visiting them what a scholar was. They would say, a scholar is someone who lives to learn and is good at it. And the thing is that they started to live like scholars. They'd go home at night and they would teach their families what they learned in school that day. And when children were pulled out of the classroom to have to go for an intervention or for some other administrative reason, they would groan because they felt badly that anybody would have to miss scholar work. Naturally, scholar work was hard work. But these first graders were primed by Crystal, and they were ready for it. And their work really paid off. By the end of the year, over 90% of Crystal students, most of whom didn't know their letters when they began, were reading at or above a third grade reading level. When I began that story, we were wondering how, besides reading aloud, we could help students think about themselves as scholars. Crystal's teaching really helps us to answer that question. What we can do is we can give students an identity to step into. Peter Johnston talks a lot about giving students identities to step into. He says that if we want children to be readers, call them readers. If we want them to be writers, call them writers. And if we want students to be scholars, talk to them as if they already are. So now that we've visited in 3 different elementary classrooms, let's change things up a little bit and head into a high school classroom. So I want to switch. I'm going to switch one more time back to the PowerPoint. The classroom I'm going to take you into next is run by Randall Munro. And Randall Munro is an author. He's a former NASA roboticist and the creator of www.xkcd.com, which is a science and math webcomic that happens to have a cult following. All right, I'm going to switch. So As the story goes, Randall Munro volunteered to teach this physics class at MIT for interested high school students. As you can imagine, this attracted the best and the brightest and most motivated, because after all, who else signs up to do learning on a Saturday? So anyways, it was midway through the first day, and Munro had the students calculating the joules of energy required to move a 5-kilogram weight. When Munro looked around, he noticed something. These students, who were the best and the brightest and the most motivated, didn't seem at all interested. Now, he could have easily blamed these kids. You know, these kids these days. But he didn't. He realized that the problem wasn't that these students weren't motivated or interested in physics. They weren't interested in his explanation of physics. And so he decided to change things up a bit. Rather than continuing to talk about how to solve for X, which is completely abstract, what he decided he did is he asked the students if they were interested in Star Wars. Now, when he asked this question, they perked up. You know, those that seemed sleepy were now awake. And he noticed this. And so he decided that he was going to go with it. And so what he told the kids was that if they knew the mass of the X-Wing, the distance that Yoda lifted it, and the strength, the gravitational strength of Dagobah, then they could figure out how much potential energy it took for Yoda to lift the X-Wing fighter from the swamp in The Empire Strikes Back. Now, for me, this seems almost as abstract as joules of energy required to lift a 5-kilogram weight. But for these kids who loved physics and Star Wars, the shift in context caused something miraculous to happen. The energy changed, no pun intended. They went right to work looking things up on the internet. Almost immediately, they found an article on Wikipedia that revealed the mass of the X-Wing. They used YouTube to estimate the distance that it was lifted. They were figuring things out before Munro could even get to them. The same unmotivated, disengaged kids were now begging to learn math and science. Why? Well, that's the important lesson of this visit. Give engaging and relevant work. Part of the secret of building classroom community is engagement. Figuring out the joules of energy of a hypothetical weight was just too abstract and disconnected from Munro's students for them to really care about figuring it out. However, when the same problem became about Star Wars, it felt more tangible. Whenever the work feels engaging and relevant, students are going to feel more inclined to learn. It's hard to resist learning when the work is interesting. Navigating interesting and engaging, however, can be tricky. To show you what I mean, come with me into yet another first grade classroom. This is one where I worked last year. The teacher, her name is Miss Bessie, and she was brilliant, brilliant. Whenever she chose books, be it for read aloud or guided reading, she thought carefully about what she knew about her students. One important detail about this group of students is that they live near the ocean. On the days I visited her, on one of the days that I visited her classroom, she had selected a book about sea life for her lowest level guided reading group. When she set the books in front of the students, they couldn't wait to dig in. They immediately began talking about the things they noticed and asked questions about the cover. They could barely wait to get started. And so she told them, dig in, get started, let's read. They opened up their books and began reading. As they read, Miss Bessie pulled up alongside each one of the children and listened. One boy, Thomas, was working very hard to read a sentence that included the word jellyfish, which is a big word for a beginning reader. He toiled to figure out this word, and Miss Bessie gave him the space that he needed. She let him deliberate without interrupting or leading him. And guess what? He got it. When he got it, he wasn't sure. So he looked to Miss Bessie to see if she would tell him if he got it right. You know, he was expecting her to tell him. But Miss Bessie said, "What are you looking at me for?" And he was sort of surprised because he knew that she knew why he was looking at her. But wise Miss Bessie, she wouldn't tell him. Instead, she asked him what he could do to figure out if it's the right word. Now, if you have ever taught primary age children, you know that the instinct that kicks in when kids do amazing things, or you're excited about what they do. We want to jump up and down, we want to clap, we want to hug them. But when we do this, we inadvertently rob children of learning opportunities. Whenever we can, we want I just did something crazy. Let me try that again. Let's see. There we go. So whenever we can, we want to let students do the work. Independence is among one of the most important goals that we can set for students. And when we do too much, students come to rely on us. If students are to become increasingly independent, we have to find the right balance between what we do and what they do, constantly reminding ourselves to allow them to do what we know that they can. Of course, this is not always easy because it sometimes means that students have to live with the discomfort of dissonance, which can make us nervous because we all know that too much struggle can shut a learner down, but too little struggle can be equally detrimental. Like I said before, this is tricky, but we have to remember some struggle is good. In fact, some struggle is great. Think about a time that you didn't know how to do something and you worked at it until you figured it out. Didn't it feel wonderful? I want students to grow and work in communities where learning is more important than knowing, where the quest to figure things out is more important than knowing the right answer. In Reading Wellness, Jan and I spend all of chapter 2 talking about helping children develop growth mindsets. We introduce a lesson called Leaning In and Leaning Out, which is a fun way to help children understand mindset, specifically the relationship between mindset, effort, and success. In this lesson, we show kids a series of images of things like snakes and children playing video games and large stacks of books and kids getting shots. So as they view these images, they have to think about whether the pictures make them say, "Oh no," and lean in, and lean out, or "Oh yeah," and lean in. Once they get the idea of what it means to lean in or out, we add another dimension to the pictures and show them something like a child reading a book and ask, is this person leaning in or out? How do you know? From there, we look for books with characters who struggle with their mindset. One book that we really like for this is Ish by Peter Reynolds. In this story, Raymond, the main character, loves to draw. and he spends all of his time drawing until one day his older brother insults one of his pictures. Raymond tries to make his drawings better, but he gets frustrated and he's ready to quit until his sister introduces him to the idea of ish. His sister teaches him to see the beauty in his process, which helps him to realize that not being perfect is okay, so long as we are giving our work our best effort. Books like Ish and Salt and Issues and Moret on the High Wire are great springboards for getting students talking about how a person's mindset can impact their learning. All right, so mindset is huge, and it definitely deserves a spot on our list of things to remember when building classroom community. So teach students to have a growth mindset. Helping children understand how leaning in or having a growth mindset increases the potential for what they could learn. It holds potential for really revolutionizing learning. Teaching a growth mindset is a relatively simple shift, and it makes me wonder, what other simple changes could we make that could really improve the overall quality of our learning community? So, to answer that question, let's continue our tour. Coincidentally, the next classroom is not a classroom in the traditional sense. Sugata Mitra, a professor of educational technology in Newcastle, England, he studies self-organized learning, and he wondered just how much children could teach themselves. So he saw places where he knew children had access to technology, in this case, remote villages in India. And what he did is he set up computer kiosks to see what children would do with them. What he observed was fascinating. What happened was the kids began to work together, and they figured things out in a relatively short amount of time. They had no previous computer experience, and now here they were able to use a computer with as much proficiency as most office secretaries. This impressed Sugata Mitra, and he began now to see what else could they do. Could they do something more complicated, like figure out the science behind DNA replication? And so that's what he did. He uploaded a program to a computer, and he gave it to these kids and said, this is hard, see what you can figure out, and I'll be back in 2 months to see how it goes. And he did. And when they came back, what he found was that they had really, they figured out a lot, but it was only about, it was a lot compared to, for what it was, like 30% of the program. And the kids with the teacher were doing better in his control group. So he decided, well, these kids need a teacher. They needed support, but he thought that they needed a different kind of support. So he found the town accountant and said, would you be their teacher? And she said, I'm not qualified. I don't know biology, DNA, science, or anything like that. And he said, no. This is what you have to do. The only thing that you have to do is stand behind the kids. And when you stand behind the kids, this is your job. You have to say things like, wow, and how did you do that? And what will you do now? Every time they do something. He called this the grandmother method. So what do you think happened? Well, as you might have guessed, the results were extraordinary. With just 2 months of human contact like this, the teacher who scaffolded them with wow and how are you going to figure that out? Their scores matched the scores of the children who were working with a trained biologist. Isn't that amazing? So it makes me think that this is a simple change and it's super worth adding to our list of ways to build a community of readers. So ask agentive questions. Asking questions that prompt children to reflect on their learning helps them to deepen their understanding. Can you imagine what would happen if our classrooms were all about giving kids tantalizing tasks and watching and listening and saying things like, wow, and how did you do that? And what will you do next? That sounds great for both kids and teachers. Okay, so let's continue our tour. Our tour in the next classroom that we're going to is a 4th grade classroom, and it is taught by Mr. Alverdi. Let's look in and see what's going on. On the whiteboard, Mr. Alverdi has written the word passion. And from the web of the words surrounding it, it looks like Mr. Alverdi and his students have talked about this word, what this word means. Right now, he's reading a book about Peter Roget, the man who wrote Roget's Thesaurus, and it's called The Right Word, written by Jen Bryant. As he reads, he stops and says, wow, Peter loved words so much, he collected them. He's got a chart next to him that he's writing on, and it looks like this. Yeah. Wait. Okay, so and it looks like this. And inside the heart of this character right here, he's jotting down the words that describe Peter Roget's passions. Words, so like words, writing, reading, plants, insects. He continues to read, stopping to allow students to chat along the way. When the story ends, he asks a poignant question. How were Peter's passions connected to his life's work? The students think and talk, and when they decide, Mr. Alverdi writes in the thought bubble above the character's head on the chart, I will write a book that helps people find just the word they are looking for. He continues to prompt students to think about what Peter Roget did throughout his life to help him achieve this goal. Students eagerly raise their hand to share ideas, and Mr. Alverdi flips through the book and rereads the sections that they mention and adds their ideas to the arms and legs of the figure. He writes things like categorized words into lists and wrote them in notebooks. And remind students when they are passionate about their work, work just doesn't feel like work. He then invites his students to think and jot down the things that they're passionate about and allows them to canvass the library for titles that fit their interests. The students are jubilant as they find books that they once loved or titles that they can't wait to read. They eagerly share their discoveries with others. Mr. Alverdi, he's walking among his students, talking with them about their interests and making recommendations for things they might want to check out. Before the visit ends, the students are seated comfortably around the room. It is nearly silent. The students are reading. Mr. Alverdi brings to mind one of Jan and my favorite quotes about learning. Educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. This brings to mind yet one more thought about building classroom community, and that is we must live and learn with passion. Passion can make a difference between a good year and a bad year, as well as a good year and a great year. Passion is a quality that is obvious in many wonderful teachers. Teachers like Mrs. Meeks, a first grade teacher from Jerry Spinelli's book, The Loser, and the very last stop on today's tour. In Mrs. Meeks's classroom, it is the first day of school, and she begins by talking to her students about their graduation from high school. She explains that they will be driving cars and taking jobs and getting ready to take their place in the world. On the board, she writes 180 and tells the students that this is the number of days they will spend in first grade. Then she multiplies 180 by 12 to calculate the 2,160 days they'll be in school. She says 2,160, the days of your journey. That is how long your adventure will last. Every one of those days will be an opportunity to learn something new. Just imagine how much you can learn in 2,160 days. Isn't that a lovely way to begin the year? Thank you, Mrs. Meeks, for reminding us that we should start the year with appreciation. After the scene in the story, Mrs. Meeks puts on her conductor's cap and pulls a train whistle out of her desk drawer and says, "All aboard the learning train. First stop, writing my own name. Who's coming aboard?" Naturally, all the children in the class raise their hands and the train pulls out of the station. That's what community, classroom community, a strong reading community is all about. Being poised and ready and eager to learn. And our hope is that your classroom is filled with learners like that too. So I'm going to stop there and switch back over to Brian. Brian, what's been happening on Twitter?
Hi, Kim. We've actually got a ton of responses. People really love your 10 kind of hints here and tips. What I'm going to say though is we've got to wrap it up because we've got the next session coming at noon, and I'm going to jump over and start them up. So everyone can join in on the conversation by using hashtag the EdCollab Gathering #4, and if you want to go there, Kim, and kind of respond to some of their tweets, you can do that now.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I'm going to just go over here and show everyone what we have coming up in session 2. There's a bunch of workshops that you can join in on. There's The Power of Mentors with Jeff Anderson and Joellen McCarthy. That's workshop number 6. There's Designing Curriculum that Inspires Creativity with Heather Rocco, Chris Bronke, Scott Egerding, and Emily Mixner. That's number 7. Then Shauna Coppola and Emily Spear have Facilitating Inquiry Research with Primary Age Students. That's workshop number 8. Then we have Moving from Diversity to Social Justice. That's workshop number 9. The Intersection of Science and English for workshop number 10. And all of these are available at the EdCollab Gatherings website. And we also just want to remind you that if you're enjoying today, even though it's completely free, we'd encourage you to support our charity for the day, which is the Book Love Foundation. So thank you very much, and thank you to Kim for an excellent presentation. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.
Have a great day.